One of the biggest transit projects out there is coming to North America. It's a subway project, and it's easily our most modern subway project yet. Toronto's Ontario line, along with new electrified regional rail, is going to take Toronto from a city that is a laggard to one that has among the best rail networks in North America, and among the best transit networks for a city of its size around the world. For the first time this week, we got a really good sense of what this future subway line is actually going to look like, and the stations and infrastructure looks incredible. Let's take a look, shall we? If you're not already, consider supporting the channel on Patreon as well as YouTube memberships to help me keep bringing you videos like this. This one I made pretty quickly to try to get it up as soon as possible after the renders were released. Of course, also don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, I've made a lot of videos about the Ontario line, as well as its predecessor, the Downtown Relief Line, which I know has a great name. I'm not going to spend the whole video talking about the minutiae of what the project is, because again, I've made a lot of previous videos talking about that subject. What I will say is that the Ontario line, along with Toronto's regional rail electrification, is the biggest transit project in North America, bar none. And in many ways, it's a better project than the previous Relief Line, which was a mostly underground subway line that was going to be using the same technology and be fully integrated, like physically integrated, into the previous subway network. The Ontario line is an independent line. It doesn't use the same technology as the existing Toronto subway, but it will be fully integrated in terms of wayfinding and fares and being able to seamlessly swap between lines. Using newer, higher performance train technology allows for the trains to take steeper gradients and tighter curves, which allows a more interesting route than what would have been previously possible. Now, what's really special about the Ontario line is it's among the only new subway lines being built through a North American city center. And unlike, say, New York's 2nd Avenue subway, the whole core portion of the line is just being built in one shot. And what's great about the Ontario line is that since it takes a blank slate approach to designing a subway in Toronto, it uses the same sort of modern and interoperable technologies you'd see around the world, from Santiago to Tokyo to Paris. The line will be capable of operating wide, 5-car long automated trains, with overhead power supply and platform screen doors at every single station from day one. That's in line with new metro lines being built in places like China and Korea, but also in places like Sydney or Sao Paulo. Now, to be clear, I can imagine the comments writing themselves. The REM is also a modern subway-style line, right? And so is HART in Honolulu. This is true, but the Ontario line uses both bigger trains and spends most of its time in the dense urban core of Toronto. While HART and the REM are super exciting projects, they're not really urban subways, they're more like regional rail. Now, I ruffled some feathers saying that this project is probably among the most impactful transit projects in the world, and let me explain. The thing with the Ontario line is that it has been needed for the longest time. Toronto has had capacity issues on its downtown portion of its subway network for literally decades, which means that massive amounts of latent demand have built up, and there are massive areas of Toronto with incredibly high density development that just don't have rapid transit access. Now, if you're wondering what latent demand is, it's basically just demand that basically goes unmet. So in the case of Toronto's subway network, it's people who would love to take trips downtown on the subway but can't because there's no room. With the Ontario line opening, these people will suddenly have an option to get to downtown Toronto, which is one of the largest and fastest growing downtowns in North America, and that will likely make the Ontario line among the most used subway lines in the Americas on day one. At the same time, the Ontario line is a connector line. It's not circumferential, a ring line around the city, but it connects up with so many different lines along its route. It connects with 4 different subway stations, one of which hasn't even opened yet, hopefully it opens soon, as well as 2 different major regional rail hubs. It's the type of line that you don't really see as the first or second line getting constructed in the subway network, because there isn't as much to connect to. But now that Toronto has a fairly substantial subway network and a burgeoning regional rail network, there's a lot of potential to connect to all of those different services with the Ontario line. At the same time, I think the Ontario line is going to set the standard for what a modern North American subway line could look like, which is the exactly same as a modern subway line in Asia or Europe. And that's great, because it means when future lines get constructed in places like San Francisco and Montreal with their potential pink line, they'll know what to do, something akin to the Ontario line. Now, someone rightly asked me on Twitter why I was sort of glorifying the complex nature of this project, since so many of my videos are talking about projects not needing to be so complex. The thing with the Ontario line is that it is just going to inherently be complex. It's a long line through some of the densest areas of North America, skyscraper forests, if you will. And as I mentioned, it connects to so many existing rail transit lines, not to mention various bus lines and also streetcar lines. So inherently the project is going to be complex, but that complexity means it connects so many different points in the city and so many other transit lines, which is likely to make it super popular. It has the ability to kind of reinvigorate the transit network that we saw with the Jubilee line extension in London, which had this sort of ability to connect a lot of areas of the city that needed tube service but just hadn't got it for the longest time. Now you came for the renderings, and so let's take a look at them. I will preface things by saying they aren't the architectural opulence seen on Toronto's York Spadina subway extension, sort of like the Jubilee line extension in terms of these big stations, designed by architects like Itis and Foster and Partners. The stations do look nice, but they have a very common design theme, with similar materials and angles and the like used across all of the different stations, so it's really clear when you look at them that they are all part of the same line. Also like Crossrail, this project is going to be really expensive, but at least, also like Crossrail, it feels like we're getting a lot for our money. Now, I reached out to some of my contacts, and the stations have been strengthened and prepared for over-station developments, towers that will go on top of them, which is why a lot of the stations, particularly the underground ones, are kind of low and have flat roofs. They're designed to have high-density development literally directly integrated into them. And the reason that those developments aren't included in the renders is because they're being developed separately. Starting at the north end of the line, we have the various elevated stations, because this section of the line will be on elevated guideways. The first of the stations is at Science Centre, which connects to the hopefully soon to be opened, under construction Eglinton Crosstown Line 5 LRT subway hybrid line that Toronto is building across its midtown. The Ontario Line station sits right above the bus terminal of this station, which should allow for pretty seamless connections. You'll also notice that the terminal stations on the Ontario Line use side platforms, which is sort of unique, at least for Toronto, and that's probably to allow for high frequency operation, which is a critical piece of this line. They're planning for 90-second headways. I'll probably make a future video to describe why side platforms can be really good for high frequency terminal operations, so make sure you're subscribed for that. You can see that the architectural design of the elevated stations again incorporates a lot of elements from, say, Crossrail, with a lot of sharp lines and a lot of really nice looking lighting, as well as a lot of glass. But there's also elements of previous Canadian metro projects, which mostly tend to be automated metro projects. This includes things like a lot of wood slats and earthy tones. I never thought I was going to say earthy tones on this channel, but I did. You'll notice in the renders that you can see the supports for the integrated overhead power line, which will power the trains. It's a lot safer than third rail and allows for you to use higher voltages. And at the same time, you can see that there are integrated sound barriers into the guideway, which are probably overkill, but are kind of standard in places like Taipei, for example. Talked about that in a previous video. At the Thorncliffe Park station, you could see the yard that stores the trains kind of nestled in behind the station itself. You can also see how the stations look particularly epic at night with all of their lights and transparency on full display. I also want to point out that there are really nice public plazas outside of the stations, which kind of remind me of newer SkyTrain stations. These are nice places to just meet with a friend, even if you aren't necessarily taking the subway or SkyTrain in that case. And they also feature wayfinding right in the public plaza, so before you even get into the station and congested, you can figure out where you're going. Now, the next type of station I want to mention are the rail corridor stations. A portion of the Ontario line, and this is one of the big differentiators from the previous relief line, uses the same corridor as Toronto's soon-to-be electrified regional rail, allowing the line to avoid some deep tunnels through the east end of Toronto. These sections have been kind of controversial, despite the fact that people living in the area have always known that there's a rail line here, and the fact that the rail line is over 100 years old. That said, I think the controversy has forced the project to really try to come up with really unique and cool stations. I'm doing a lot of this with my hands, but the stations are super unique, super cool looking, and they're not overbearing. They incorporate a lot of the same elements as the elevated stations, but they're largely over intersections or streets, which allows for them to span with multiple entrances. The stations also seem to make heavy use of corten or weathered steel, which gives them a really nice industrial look. Even the smaller elements are done really nice, like the transition of the rail berm into the station is done with a green wall. Nicely designed public plazas are also here, and there's even bike storage integrated right into the station, which is a feature I've always wanted in Toronto. These stations are legitimately going to make these neighborhoods way nicer and way easier to access too. So even if the line is controversial today, I think in 10 or 20 years, people will be really happy that it's here. I also have to say the Gerrard station in particular, which integrates this giant kind of truss bridge structure into it, looks incredibly cool. Now, getting into the underground stations, there's a lot less to say, since the outsides of the station, all the renders show are outsides for now, are kind of limited because they are mostly underground. The nice thing about these stations is that the above ground pavilions, while they do exist, and maybe that isn't the greatest trend of modern subway building in the English-speaking world, they are less imposing and large than seen on, for example, the Eglinton Crosstown. They also appear to feature things like curved glass, which if that actually happened would be crazy. It's also interesting to point out that if you actually look at the entrances, they have the TVMs and fare gates right actually at the entryway, which isn't something you see in every subway station in Toronto today, but is a really nice feature actually. It again keeps congestion at street level rather than deep within the station. At the same time, the open space added in front of the station buildings adds some place for people to queue up when waiting for streetcars and buses, and I think that's a really nice incorporated feature. Now, one of the station entrances near Osgoode Hall was quite controversial because it will take out a corner of the plot of land and it will remove part of an old fence and some trees, but honestly, this seems like a pretty good entryway location. Someone mentioned to me that, again, it will be nice because it will provide a bit more room for people to queue up for the streetcar line that's directly adjacent, and at the same time, some additional trees can be planted around the entrance. The other nice thing about these station pavilions compared to stations where you had to go down a set of stairs from the sidewalk is that they can provide weather protection in the winter. So if you're waiting for a streetcar, you can just kind of tuck yourself in there and wait till it comes up to go out and get on it if it's, say, raining or snowing. Now, what's interesting is that Queen Station, which is the interchange with Toronto's most used subway line, the Yonge line, appears to mainly use existing entryways, so I'm not entirely sure what's going on here, but maybe there will be expansions to the underground circulation space. I mean, I imagine there will be because most people won't be exiting here, but rather transferring lines, at least most of the new passengers. There's also a nice integration with some of the heritage buildings that we didn't see so extensively on Eglinton that look really nice, particularly at King and Bathurst. And I think along with new high-density developments at these locations, they're going to create a really nice urban environment. It's also really just cool for me as someone who lives in Toronto to see all of these different locations and think, wow, I can go to Queen and Spadina or King and Bathurst on the subway now, which will make it way easier for me to get to these really nice neighborhoods and locations. Now, there are two big regional rail interchanges on the line, East Harbour and Exhibition. East Harbour is being constructed as part of a GO project, and so it isn't included in this latest round of renderings, but that's okay because Exhibition is, and wow, the station is amazing. As I mentioned in a previous video, we already had a general sense of what the station was going to look like, but now we have like a firm render and it looks so cool. It's an overhead concourse station, kind of like Reading in the UK, and it's way better for the space. The existing station gets super congested when an adjacent soccer game at the stadium that's literally right next door gets out because it only has a really small pedestrian tunnel connecting it with the neighborhood to the north, Liberty Village. This station with its big overhead concourse is probably going to be a lot better. At the same time, I believe the station will enable people to cross from one side to the other without actually having to pay a fare. It seems natural, and I believe the existing tunnels allow you to do that, which is also really nice for neighborhood connectivity. Now, the way the station is transformed, as an overhead concourse station would, is that it has an overhead concourse where people can wait for their trains above the tracks and then travel down to the platforms to board when their train arrives, or when they want to travel, especially in the case of the Ontario line, which is a metro. The station actually has new platforms, so now every GO track, there are 4, will have a platform on it, which is nice because it makes it a bit more of a hub and means that people from express trains can transfer to the Ontario line instead of congesting Toronto's downtown Union Station. I also have to say the architecture and design is just so nice. It's kind of like a nice, relatively large European regional rail station. Kind of like East Cross in Berlin, much smaller, but kind of like it, or like Abbey Wood in London. I just love the design of it, including the visible structure and the cross members and all of these different things. It just looks really nice. I can really imagine meeting friends in the concourse above the platforms before going to get on the subway, for example. Now, the new station is really wide, so it actually goes right up against a new street that'll be running along the south end of Liberty Village. And so accessing the north side of the station happens with a pedestrian bridge over the street where there is a pavilion building that you connect to. And I believe there's actually going to be developments directly integrated into that building, which will be really cool because you'll be able to go hypothetically straight from the development across the pedestrian bridge into the station without ever having to go onto street level. You can also just tell how big the station is by seeing the view of it from the elevated highway next door, which is not short. The last thing I will say is that while Exhibition is totally epic and the roofline looks really cool and the integrated canopies and the design, it's awesome, I am a little disappointed that we seem to be able to do something so epic here, but not at Spadina, because something like this at Spadina would be really game-changing. Please, can we do that? Please. Anyways, I think all of these renders are incredibly exciting because it really shows the scope of this project. I think a lot of people were concerned when the Ontario line got announced that it was going to be a kind of toy train project with not enough capacity or large stations. And I think with these station renderings, that can be put to rest. These stations are designed for massive passenger capacity and transfers. And at the same time, while they're standardized, unlike the TY-SSE, they're not bland like the Eglinton Crosstown stations. They have a lot of character and they have a unique look to each one. At the same time, they look nice, which is really nice for public transit. I think having nice looking infrastructure is good. So with that, we have the Ontario line. I'm gonna keep covering the project over the years as it gets built because it's now officially under construction. It was kind of already under construction because they're not actually digging the tunnels yet or anything. Don't tell anyone that. But I'm really excited for this project. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. And as always, thanks for watching.